Imagine stepping into a medieval forest as the last traces of daylight fade. The trees tower above you like walls of shadow, their branches whispering in the wind. The air is damp, the paths uncertain, and every sound seems louder than it should. A snap of a twig might be a wild boar. A howl in the distance might be wolves circling closer. And beyond the physical dangers, the people of the Middle Ages believed the woods were alive with spirits, demons, and restless souls waiting to lead travelers astray. Spending just one night in such a place would test every ounce of courage you had, and for most of us today, it would be almost impossible. This is why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval forest. Before we begin this journey through history, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel. *History for Sleep*. Here, we bring you stories from the past, told slowly and calmly, perfect for those who want to drift off into dreams while learning something new. In the comments, let us know what topics fascinate you most, and tell us when you like to listen, whether it's as you're falling asleep, while you're relaxing after a long day, or even in the quiet early hours of the morning. Your thoughts help guide the stories we tell. Now, let us step deeper into the shadows of history, where the medieval night closes in, and where survival was far less certain than we might ever imagine. When night fell upon the medieval forest, it was as though the world transformed into another realm entirely. The familiar paths that villagers might use in the daylight became unrecognizable in the gloom, twisting into confusing shapes as shadows lengthened and blurred. Without lanterns, torches, or even the faint glow of a distant village, the darkness was overwhelming, pressing in from every side. For people of the Middle Ages, this deep darkness was not simply the absence of light, but a place where the known world ended and the mysterious, dangerous unknown began. To step into the forest at night was to enter a place where every sense was heightened, every sound exaggerated, and every fear magnified. The sheer immensity of the trees was part of this fear. Great oaks, beeches, and pines rose high overhead, their branches stretching so wide that even moonlight struggled to filter down. What little light did make it through painted the forest floor in shifting patches, where a trick of the eye might turn a fallen log into a crouching beast or a shrub into the shape of a lurking figure. Travelers who dared to cross the forest after sunset would often describe how their hearts raced at the sight of phantom forms that melted into nothing when they came closer. It was a reminder that the forest was as much a place of imagination as it was of reality, a stage upon which the human mind could conjure terrors of its own making. Yet the forest was not only a place of dread. To many, it held a strange and almost holy beauty in its mystery. The smell of damp earth, the song of night birds, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind could also inspire awe. In a time when most lives were spent within the boundaries of villages, fields, or castles, the forest remained a wild and untamed world that stood apart. It was the edge of civilization, the reminder that nature was vast, powerful, and beyond human control. For some, the forest represented freedom and wonder. For others, it was the dwelling place of death itself. What made the medieval forest particularly haunting at night was the way it combined both these feelings, fear and wonder, into a single overwhelming experience. Those who walked its paths often spoke of being torn between admiration and dread, finding themselves pausing to listen to the beauty of an owl's call while at the same time glancing nervously into the shadows for any sign of danger. This mixture made the forest a powerful symbol in medieval culture, appearing in countless myths, legends, and folktales. To sleep within its borders was unthinkable for most common folk, and yet there were always those who had no choice, whether because of travel, exile, or sheer misfortune. The forest was also a place of boundaries, both real and imagined. It was a frontier between villages and kingdoms, where laws were weaker and danger was greater. At night, these boundaries grew even more uncertain. To cross into the forest was to step into a liminal space, neither fully part of the human world, nor entirely apart from it. Many medieval people believed the forest itself was a threshold into the supernatural, where the veil between the earthly and the spiritual was thinner. This is why tales of spirits, fairies, demons, and witches so often began at the edge of the woods or deep within its dark heart. The forest at night became not just a physical danger, but a spiritual one as well. For a medieval traveler, even the most basic comforts were stripped away by the forest night. Without the light of hearth or home, without the companionship of a familiar face, the experience could be profoundly isolating. The mind filled the emptiness with imagined presences, eyes watching from the darkness, footsteps echoing faintly in the undergrowth. These sensations could become overwhelming, driving people to panic or despair. Modern readers, who might think of a forest night as an opportunity for camping or adventure, would find the medieval reality far harsher. There were no sleeping bags or flashlights, no marked trails or safe campsites. Instead, there was only the uncertainty of survival until dawn. In this sense, the medieval forest at night was a mirror of human vulnerability. It reminded people of how small they truly were, how fragile in the face of nature's power. The villagers and nobles alike who lived near these woods understood this vulnerability all too well, and they respected the forest accordingly. To underestimate it was folly. To enter it without preparation was often fatal. And so, while the forest in daylight might provide timber, game, or herbs, at night it became a world apart, one that no sensible person would enter lightly. It was this reputation, built on centuries of experience and fear, that gave the medieval forest its aura of both wonder and terror. As we continue our journey through this tale, we will see how these forests shaped the lives, beliefs, and imaginations of the people who lived near them. For now, remember that to last even a single night within their depths would have been an ordeal beyond what most modern people could endure. The forest was not simply a setting of medieval life, it was one of its greatest challenges. One of the most immediate dangers awaiting anyone who stepped into a medieval forest after dark was the presence of wild animals. In an age before rifles, tranquilizers, and organized wildlife management, the beasts of the woods lived much closer to humans, and they were far less afraid. Wolves, boars, bears, lynxes, and even packs of feral dogs roamed freely, and each of these creatures brought its own peril. To hear a rustle in the bushes at night might mean little, or it might mean the approach of something far more dangerous than the human imagination could conjure. In a time when people were smaller, weaker, and far less protected by technology than we are today, such encounters could be truly life-threatening. Wolves, perhaps more than any other animal, haunted the medieval imagination. Packs of wolves prowled the forests across Europe, howling at the moon and working together with a frightening intelligence. Travelers who encountered them at night often told of the terrible sound of many paws moving through the undergrowth at once, or the glint of yellow eyes catching the light of a torch. Wolves could bring down cattle and even horses, so a lone person standing in their path was in grave danger. For villagers, the wolf was more than a predator. It was a symbol of chaos and destruction, often likened to the devil himself in sermons and folklore. To meet one in the dark forest was to feel the weight of centuries of fear pressing down upon you. Just as dangerous, and sometimes even deadlier, was the wild boar. Unlike the wolf, which might stalk and hesitate, the boar was notorious for its sudden, furious charges. With long, sharp tusks and immense strength, a wild boar could kill a man with ease. Hunters with spears and trained dogs sometimes took days to track and wear down a single boar, and many were injured or killed in the process. Now imagine stumbling across one by accident, in the dead of night, with no weapon in hand and no way to defend yourself. For medieval people, this was a nightmare that lingered in the mind long after the danger had passed. The sound of grunting in the brush or the snapping of undergrowth could be enough to make a traveler freeze, knowing that escape might be impossible. Bears, though less common in certain regions by the later Middle Ages, still roamed large tracts of Europe. These massive animals could weigh several hundred pounds and were known to tear apart livestock or even attack hunters who threatened their cubs. In the darkness of the forest, the presence of a bear was nearly impossible to anticipate until it was too late. The sheer size and strength of such a creature made it almost mythical in the eyes of villagers, who often included tales of bears in their legends. Unlike wolves, which symbolized cunning, or boars, which embodied rage, the bear represented raw power. To cross paths with one at night was considered a death sentence. Even smaller predators added to the sense of danger. Lynxes, with their sharp claws and stealthy movements, could ambush prey from the trees. Packs of wild dogs, descended from strays that had multiplied near villages, could be just as ferocious as wolves and more accustomed to the scent of humans. Foxes and martens, though less threatening to people, could still cause unease when they darted across paths or cried out in the night. These animals filled the forest with life, making the experience of walking through it after dark a constant reminder that humans were not the masters of this domain. The danger of wild animals was amplified by the lack of protection. In modern times, we have strong boots, reinforced clothing, and weapons that can keep beasts at bay. In the Middle Ages, a traveler might have only a thin cloak, a walking stick, or perhaps a small knife. Even armed hunters risked their lives with each pursuit, and most ordinary people had neither the skill nor the equipment to defend themselves. This meant that even the smallest encounter could escalate into disaster, leaving a person wounded, stranded, or worse. Injuries in the forest could be as dangerous as the beasts themselves, since infection and blood loss were constant threats. But perhaps most unnerving of all was the soundscape these animals created. Wolves howling in the distance could unsettle even the bravest men, while the sudden grunt of a boar or the roar of a bear might send chills down the spine. At night, without sight to guide them, people relied heavily on sound, and the noises of the forest often blurred together, leaving them guessing what might be nearby. This uncertainty made the fear even sharper. Was that a deer moving quietly through the brush, or something far worse? Such questions could keep a traveler awake through the entire night, their heart pounding at every crackle of leaves. For medieval people, animals were not only physical dangers, but also spiritual symbols. Wolves were tied to the devil, boars to untamed rage, and bears to a force beyond human strength. These associations made encounters with them not just frightening, but almost otherworldly, as though the beasts carried with them the power of myth itself. It was not difficult to see why so many folktales and legends turned animals into characters of great symbolic weight. They were reminders of humanity's fragile place within the natural order, creatures who could end a human life as easily as one might crush an insect. To last a night in a medieval forest was to share space with these animals, whether one saw them directly or only heard them lurking in the darkness. For villagers who relied on their fields, for hunters who pursued game, and for travelers who had no choice but to cross these shadowy domains, the presence of such beasts was always in mind. For us today, imagining that vulnerability helps explain why the medieval forest loomed so large in the human imagination. To walk among these animals was to step into their world, and in their world, survival was never guaranteed. If the wild animals of the medieval forest represented the untamed danger of nature, the human threats lurking there were often even more feared. For villagers and travelers, the forest was not only home to beasts, but also to men who lived outside the laws of society. Bandits, highwaymen, and outlaws found the darkness of the woods a perfect hiding place, using the thick trees and winding paths to ambush the unsuspecting. To wander into a medieval forest at night was to risk crossing paths with people who had nothing to lose, and who often survived by taking from others by force. Bandits were a constant concern across medieval Europe. Roads were few, and patrols were limited, which made isolated stretches of woodland a haven for ambushes. These criminals waited in silence for merchants, pilgrims, or peasants carrying food or goods, striking quickly before disappearing into the shadows. At night, their presence was even more terrifying. Without torches or guards, a lone traveler could be robbed, beaten, or left for dead, their cries swallowed by the trees. Tales of such ambushes circulated from village to village, reinforcing the idea that the forest was never safe after dark. Outlaws, meanwhile, were those who had been formally cast out of society by law. To be declared an outlaw was to lose all legal protection, meaning anyone could harm you without punishment. Many such people fled to the forests, where they built hidden camps, living off what they could steal or hunt. These groups often grew into small communities, sustained by raids on nearby farms or travelers. Though not every outlaw was violent, the desperation of life in the woods made kindness rare. For ordinary people, stumbling across such a camp in the middle of the night was one of the greatest fears imaginable. A fire glowing between the trees might mean warmth and companionship, or it might mean death. The forest provided perfect cover for these men and women. Dense foliage and twisting terrain made pursuit nearly impossible. Local villagers often knew the bandits were nearby, but they dared not confront them for fear of revenge. At night, the line between hunter and hunted blurred. A traveler might hear voices drifting through the woods, see the glint of metal in torchlight, or find a path suddenly blocked by strangers with weapons drawn. For the unarmed or unprepared, survival in such encounters depended entirely on luck and mercy, both of which were scarce in a medieval forest. There was also the matter of soldiers and mercenaries. Not all armed men in the woods were bandits by trade. Some were deserters from armies, or wandering swordsmen without masters. These men, hardened by war and accustomed to taking what they needed, could be just as ruthless as criminals. In times of conflict, when armies swept across the countryside, many soldiers stayed behind, hiding in the woods and preying upon civilians. For travelers, it made little difference whether they were ambushed by a bandit or by a hungry, desperate man who had once served in war. The result was often the same: violence and loss. The reputation of forests as havens for outlaws entered deeply into folklore and storytelling. Legends like that of Robin Hood romanticized the figure of the noble outlaw who robbed the rich and spared the poor. But for real medieval people, the reality was far less charming. Outlaws were not heroes. They were a constant menace, unpredictable and deadly. Parents warned their children not to wander near the woods, not only because of wolves and spirits, but also because of the men who lived beyond the law. The very idea of spending a night in such company filled people with dread. The darkness of the forest only amplified this fear. Without light, one could not see who approached or from which direction. A soft footstep on leaves could mean a friend or a foe about to strike. Bandits often used the cover of night to their advantage, creeping silently upon travelers or creeping into camps while their victims slept. For those caught unaware, the sudden appearance of armed men in the shadows was often the last sight they ever saw. Stories of such raids spread quickly, reminding everyone that the forest was a realm where human cruelty thrived alongside natural peril. What made this threat particularly chilling was that it played upon the weakness of trust. A voice in the dark might call out in greeting, offering companionship or safety. To answer could mean finding an ally or walking straight into a trap. Many medieval people learned to ignore such calls, fearing deception. In this way, the forest became a place where even human contact was laced with suspicion. Strangers were not sources of comfort. They were potential dangers waiting to reveal themselves. For modern people, it is easy to imagine the forest at night as peaceful solitude. But in the Middle Ages, solitude was rarely possible. Even when no one was visible, the possibility of outlaws hiding nearby was always in the back of one's mind. To survive a night in the medieval forest was not only about avoiding wolves or finding warmth, it was also about escaping the notice of those who lived outside the law. And in the silent dark of the woods, with the fire casting only a small circle of light, that fear was constant and unrelenting. Perhaps the greatest challenge of all in a medieval forest at night was not the wild animals or the lurking bandits, but the simple, overwhelming presence of darkness itself. In our modern world, we rarely experience true darkness. Street lamps, lanterns, and the faint glow of cities and towns mean that even the night sky is often softened by human light. But in the Middle Ages, when the sun slipped below the horizon, the forest descended into a blackness so complete that it could feel like stepping into another world entirely. For those who entered, there was no comfort in distant lights and no escape from the void that surrounded them. The medieval traveler might have a torch or a lantern, but these sources of light were feeble compared to what we are accustomed to today. A torch flickered uncertainly, casting long shifting shadows that could make every tree seem alive. A lantern, fueled by oil or tallow, gave off only a dim glow, barely enough to illuminate a few steps ahead. Beyond that small circle of light, the forest remained impenetrable. This limited vision meant that danger was always near, yet always hidden. Every sound came from an unseen source, and every imagined figure at the edge of the firelight might or might not be real. The human mind does not rest easily in such darkness. Our eyes strain, our ears sharpen, and our imagination fills in the gaps. A snapping twig can become the footfall of a predator, while the rustle of leaves becomes a spirit passing unseen. The psychological weight of this darkness was immense for medieval people who already believed the night to be filled with supernatural forces. To be surrounded by it in the forest was to feel exposed and vulnerable, as though the world itself had turned against you. In that environment, fear grew quickly, feeding upon itself until it overwhelmed reason. But beyond fear, there was also disorientation. Without light, even the most familiar paths became twisted and strange. Landmarks vanished, and the trees seemed to rearrange themselves into endless walls. Travelers who knew a road well by day could become hopelessly lost at night, wandering in circles until exhaustion or despair set in. It was not uncommon for people to vanish in the woods, simply because they lost their way after dark. For those unlucky enough to be caught without a torch or lantern, the blackness was absolute, a suffocating shroud that left them stumbling blind, unsure of where to step or what lay ahead. This darkness was more than physical. It was symbolic. In medieval thought, light represented safety, knowledge, and God's presence, while darkness symbolized ignorance, danger, and evil. To be in the forest at night was to be literally and spiritually immersed in darkness. Preachers often used the imagery of a dark forest to describe the perils of sin, and poets spoke of wandering souls lost in shadow until the dawn of salvation. In this way, the night forest was not only a physical hazard, but a metaphor for the struggles of life itself. To endure its darkness was to confront not only external dangers, but inner fears as well. Fires provided some comfort, yet they brought their own risks. A campfire could ward off animals and light a small space, but it also announced your presence to anyone lurking in the distance. The glow of flames might draw bandits, or worse, signal to supernatural beings that a soul was near. Travelers often hesitated to light a fire unless absolutely necessary, balancing the need for warmth and sight against the fear of being found. For those who did, the circle of firelight created a fragile island of safety, surrounded by an endless sea of black. To step beyond it was to plunge back into the unknown. Imagine sitting by such a fire, listening to the logs crackle and pop, while beyond the glow, the forest presses close. You cannot see more than a few feet ahead, but you hear everything: the low hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a wolf, the rustle of unseen movement in the brush. Each sound seems amplified by the silence, echoing in your mind long after it fades. Sleep becomes nearly impossible, for even the act of closing your eyes feels like surrendering to whatever waits beyond the darkness. In this way, the night forest was as much an ordeal of the mind as it was of the body. For medieval people, accustomed to lives filled with struggle and hardship, even they found the night forest an unbearable trial. Many avoided it altogether, choosing to travel only during daylight hours. Inns, monasteries, and small villages sprang up along major roads, precisely to give shelter to travelers who feared being caught in the woods after sundown. These resting places were not simply conveniences. They were lifelines, sparing countless lives from the terrors of the night. Those who missed such refuge and were forced to spend the night in the forest were pitied and feared, as though they had ventured into the very jaws of death. To last a single night in a medieval forest meant facing the suffocating darkness without the comforts we take for granted today. It meant relying on a flickering flame, a trembling hand, and a heart filled with prayers that the dawn would come quickly. And even then, for many, the darkness brought not rest, but a long, sleepless vigil, filled with the certainty that the forest was watching them as much as they were watching it. When daylight fades and silence seems to settle over the medieval forest, the night reveals that it is never truly silent. The darkness is alive with sound, and it was these sounds that often terrified people far more than the dangers they could see. A crackling branch, the soft hoot of an owl, the distant howl of wolves, each noise seemed sharper, louder, and more menacing in the stillness of night. For medieval people, with no scientific explanations for most of what they heard, these sounds often carried supernatural meaning, fueling a host of legends and fears that made the forest an even more terrifying place to endure after sunset. The human ear, sharpened by the absence of sight, plays tricks in the darkness. A breeze shifting through the leaves might resemble whispering voices. The groan of a tree swaying in the wind could sound like a distant scream. Even the scurrying of a small animal across the forest floor became magnified, until it felt as though some much larger creature was lurking nearby. These distortions of sound were not mere tricks of perception. They became the raw material for stories told around hearths and fires. Villagers who had never dared spend a night in the woods nevertheless spoke of the cries and voices that drifted through the trees, passed down as warnings of what awaited the unlucky. Owls were among the most mysterious of these nighttime voices. Their haunting calls pierced the silence with eerie regularity, and because they often echoed, people believed multiple spirits were calling at once. In many parts of Europe, owls were associated with death, bad omens, or witches in disguise. To hear an owl hooting above you in the forest was taken as a warning that misfortune was near, and some villagers made the sign of the cross or muttered prayers to drive away its influence. The owl, a harmless hunter of mice and small creatures, became a symbol of dread when its voice echoed in the medieval night. Equally unnerving was the howl of wolves. A single wolf might cry out in the distance, answered moments later by another, until the forest seemed filled with voices. To medieval ears, these howls were not just signals between animals. They were proof that the beasts were gathering, preparing to hunt. Wolves were already linked in the popular imagination with devils and demons, and their cries seemed to confirm the presence of evil in the night. Travelers often froze in place when they heard wolves, unable to know how close the pack might be, or whether it was already watching them from the shadows. Even the sounds of the forest itself could be terrifying. Trees creaked and groaned as their trunks shifted in the wind, producing sounds like moans or sighs. Water rushing through unseen streams gurgled in ways that resembled muttering voices. The call of foxes, with their high-pitched cries, could sound disturbingly human, like a child wailing or a woman screaming. Without explanation, these noises fed directly into superstition, convincing many that spirits, demons, or wandering souls were moving through the woods. Once these beliefs took root, Each sound became evidence of the unseen world, reinforcing the terror of the night. Superstitions thrived in this environment. Medieval people believed that the forest was home to ghosts of the unburied, fairies who lured wanderers astray, and witches who gathered in secret. The sounds of the night seemed to confirm these fears. A sudden rustling might be the movement of an invisible spirit. A sharp crack in the distance could mean that a witch's curse was near. Every unexplained sound became a story, and every story added to the growing lore of the forest. In this way, the woods at night were not just a physical danger, but a spiritual one, filled with invisible forces that revealed themselves through sound. For those forced to spend a night in such a place, the experience could be overwhelming. Imagine sitting in the dark, your small fire sputtering low, when a distant cry echoes through the trees. You cannot tell what it is, but it is unlike any noise you have heard before. Your heart races, your breathing quickens, and suddenly every sound around you seems amplified. The forest is no longer just a collection of trees. It is alive, speaking in a language of creaks, groans, and cries. To medieval people, this was not imagination. It was the reality of the supernatural world pressing close. These experiences left deep marks on culture. Songs, poems, and folktales often described the sounds of the forest as voices of spirits, warnings of danger, or signs from God. Priests and storytellers used them to remind people of the fragility of life and the ever-present battle between good and evil. Parents warned their children to stay near the village at night, using the strange sounds of the woods as cautionary tales. And for those who had endured a night in the forest, the memories of what they heard stayed with them long after the danger had passed. To us today, the hoot of an owl or the creak of a tree may hold no terror, explained away by science and familiarity. But for the people of the Middle Ages, those sounds carried weight and mystery, transforming the forest into a stage for fear. It was not enough to simply see danger. To hear it without explanation was to feel surrounded by forces beyond human understanding. And in that darkness, with every sound magnified and misunderstood, superstition thrived, making the forest at night not just dangerous, but haunted in every sense of the word. If the darkness of the medieval forest was oppressive, and its sounds unsettling, then it was the belief in spirits that gave the night its true terror. For people of the Middle Ages, the forest was not merely filled with animals and hidden men, but also with unseen forces, beings who lurked between the trees and revealed themselves only to the unfortunate. These beliefs were not fringe ideas, but deeply ingrained in daily life, shaping how people saw the world around them. To step into a forest at night was to step into a realm where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, and where spirits roamed freely. Among the most common fears was that of wandering souls, those who had died violently, or without proper burial, or in sin. It was said that such spirits lingered in the places where they had met their end, crying out in pain or seeking revenge on the living. Forests, with their frequent battles, murders, and accidents, were thought to be crowded with these restless dead. Travelers told stories of ghostly figures appearing on paths, beckoning them deeper into the trees, or calling out in familiar voices to lure them astray. To hear such a call was a dangerous omen, for it was believed that if you followed, you would never return. There were also tales of fairies and other supernatural beings dwelling in the woods. Unlike the gentle, whimsical fairies of later folklore, medieval fairies were often dangerous tricksters, capable of enchanting or destroying those who crossed their paths. They were said to lure travelers with music, lead them in circles until they collapsed in exhaustion, or steal them away entirely. Forest clearings lit by moonlight were sometimes feared as places of fairy gatherings, where mortals risked stumbling into otherworldly dances from which they could never escape. The belief was so strong that people carried charms and iron objects to ward off fairy influence, clutching them tightly as they passed through the night woods. Demons, too, were thought to wander the forest. Preachers warned that the devil himself prowled the dark, whispering temptations into the ears of the unwary. To sleep in the forest without prayer was to invite possession, or worse, to be carried off into damnation. Strange lights now understood as natural phenomena, like swamp gas or fireflies, were interpreted as will-o'-the-wisps, spirits sent to mislead travelers into swamps and bogs where they would drown. Each unexplained sight or sound confirmed the presence of these beings, reinforcing the belief that the forest was a gateway between the human and the supernatural worlds. Witches, too, were often imagined to make their homes in the woods. Secluded clearings and hidden huts were places where spells were cast, potions brewed, and dark pacts made. At night, villagers imagined that witches gathered for secret rites, their chants drifting on the wind to chill the hearts of anyone nearby. Even if no one saw them, the mere thought of their presence was enough to keep travelers awake and fearful, clutching religious charms for protection. For many, the forest was not just dangerous, it was cursed, alive with malice and dark power. The role of the church in these beliefs cannot be overlooked. Priests often reinforced the idea that the wilderness was a place of sin and temptation, where the devil's power was strongest. The forest stood apart from the ordered life of the village, beyond the reach of church bells and the comfort of the cross. To enter it at night was to leave behind the protection of God's community and expose oneself to spiritual danger. Sermons described the forest as a testing ground for the soul, where the faithful might be tempted or tormented by evil spirits. In this way, religious teaching blended with folklore, making the fear of the woods an article of faith as much as imagination. For the ordinary villager, these beliefs shaped behavior in very practical ways. People avoided the forest at night whenever possible, timing their journeys carefully to ensure they would reach shelter before dusk. Children were warned never to wander near the trees, lest spirits seize them. Travelers carried amulets, rosaries, or blessed herbs as protection, whispering prayers as they moved through the dark. Every shadow was watched carefully. Every sound was treated as a possible warning, and every step forward was made with caution. The forest was not just a physical place, it was a spiritual battleground. And yet, for all their fear, medieval people also respected the spirits they believed dwelled in the woods. Just as one might avoid angering a nobleman or a king, one did not lightly provoke the otherworldly. Offerings were sometimes left at forest shrines, small gifts meant to appease the unseen forces. Stories told of those who mocked or disrespected the spirits, only to vanish forever. In this way, fear and reverence blended into a worldview in which the forest was not only dangerous, but sacred in its own strange way. To survive a night in a medieval forest, then, meant more than avoiding wolves or outlaws. It meant enduring the invisible company of spirits, demons, and fairies, and guarding one's soul as much as one's body. In the stillness of the dark, where the line between real and imagined blurred, these beliefs filled the silence, making every rustle, every flicker of light, and every distant cry a reminder that the forest was never empty. For medieval people, it was alive with presences both seen and unseen, and to walk among them was to risk far more than one's life. Although most people in the Middle Ages did everything they could to avoid being in the forest at night, there were always those who had no choice. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, and desperate villagers sometimes found themselves on the road too late, forced to enter the trees after the sun had already sunk below the horizon. For these unlucky souls, the night forest became not a story told at the hearth, but a living ordeal, one they would remember for the rest of their days. Their courage, or misfortune, provides a glimpse into what it truly meant to brave the medieval woods after dark. Merchants often had the most to lose. Carrying goods, coins, or valuable wares, they were prime targets for bandits who used the darkness as their shield. To avoid delay, merchants sometimes pressed on into the night, trusting to a small group of guards, or hoping their luck would hold. The forest, however, was an unforgiving place. A cartwheel might break on a hidden route, or a horse might shy at the sound of wolves. The deeper the merchant went, the more he realized that wealth was little comfort when surrounded by shadows. Tales spread of entire caravans vanishing into the woods, their goods never seen again, leaving behind only whispers of wolves or outlaws. Pilgrims, too, frequently found themselves in danger. Driven by devotion, they traveled long distances to holy shrines, often with few resources and no protection. Many were poor peasants walking barefoot, with only a staff in hand and a bundle of food. If their journey stretched longer than expected, they sometimes had no choice but to pass through forests after dark. For them, the night was a test of faith as much as endurance. They prayed loudly, sang hymns, or clutched their relics, believing these acts would ward off evil spirits. Some returned to their villages with stories of ghostly lights that tried to lead them astray, or of wolves circling but never daring to attack, convinced that divine protection had carried them through. Messengers faced a different burden. Kings, lords, and bishops relied on swift communication, and that often meant sending riders through forests by night. A royal message could not wait until morning, and so these men spurred their horses down narrow paths lit only by torches or the faint glimmer of moonlight. They rode knowing that every sound might be the start of an ambush, and that their failure could bring not only personal death, but disaster for those awaiting their news. For messengers, the night forest was not a place to fear, but a duty to endure, though many never lived to deliver their words. Even ordinary villagers sometimes found themselves caught by the setting sun. A trip to gather firewood, herbs, or game could stretch longer than expected, leaving them stranded as the light faded. Unlike merchants or messengers, these villagers had little experience with travel and often no weapons at all. They might huddle beneath trees, whispering prayers and clutching charms, hoping the night would pass quickly. For them, every moment was filled with terror, and the memory of a single night in the forest could become a cautionary tale retold for generations. Despite the risks, some chose to enter the forest deliberately after dark. Smugglers, for instance, used the cover of night to move goods unseen by tax collectors or lords. Lovers met in hidden glades, believing the night shielded them from prying eyes. Outlaws, already accustomed to danger, moved by night to avoid capture. These individuals accepted the risks because the darkness gave them freedom. Yet even they understood that the forest was not their ally. It was a constant threat, and many who relied on its shadows never returned from them. The accounts of those who braved the night woods reveal both courage and desperation. Chroniclers recorded stories of pilgrims stumbling upon hermits who offered shelter, of merchants surviving ambushes by sheer luck, and of messengers chased for miles by wolves until they collapsed at a monastery gate. These tales remind us that the medieval forest was not an abstract idea, but a lived reality. Each traveler who entered after sunset carried with them the weight of countless fears and the hope that dawn would come before disaster struck. For us today, walking into a forest at night might seem adventurous or even calming, but for the medieval traveler, it was something far more serious. It was a gamble with fate, with their lives, and sometimes with their very souls. To last a night in the medieval forest was to stand against not only hunger, cold, and predators, but also the crushing fear that every sound and shadow concealed a threat. Few would choose such a journey willingly, and those who did had reasons as urgent as survival itself. In the medieval world, maps were crude, signposts were rare, and the idea of well-marked trails through forests barely existed. Villagers knew their own local woods by memory, but once one strayed too far from familiar landmarks, the forest became a maze of endless trees and twisting undergrowth. By day, this could be confusing enough, but at night, when darkness closed in and every path seemed the same, the danger of getting lost was immense. To lose your way in the medieval forest was not just inconvenient, it could be a death sentence. Without the steady light of torches or lanterns, the forest became disorienting. Even with a small flame, shadows played tricks, making paths appear where none existed. Branches stretched like grasping arms, rocks and stumps seemed to shift position, and what appeared to be a clear trail might end suddenly in a tangle of thorns. A traveler could walk in circles for hours without realizing it, each step leading them deeper into confusion. Many medieval accounts describe people wandering until exhaustion forced them to collapse, unable to tell east from west, or even remember which direction they had come from. The fear of losing one's way was not only physical, but psychological. In the dark, when familiar markers vanished, the forest became endless, stretching in all directions without hope of escape. Panic often set in quickly, causing people to run blindly, further disorienting themselves. The mind, already sharpened by fear, filled the silence with imagined threats. Footsteps just behind, eyes watching from the shadows, whispers carried by the wind. For some, the terror of being lost was enough to drive them into despair, convincing them they were doomed long before hunger, cold, or beasts reached them. Getting lost also meant losing access to water, food, and safety. A villager might have carried bread or dried meat, but supplies were limited, and without knowledge of where streams or edible plants were, survival could not last long. In summer, thirst and exhaustion set in quickly. In winter, cold and hunger tightened their grip within hours. Wolves and other predators, sensing weakness, often followed lost travelers. Even if they did not attack immediately, their presence added to the growing terror. A single night could stretch into what felt like eternity, with each hour bringing new dangers closer. Superstition made the experience even worse. To lose your way in the woods was not seen as mere misfortune, but as a sign of spiritual interference. People believed fairies or spirits led travelers astray, confusing their senses and causing them to walk in circles. Tales warned of will-o'-the-wisps, ghostly lights that danced in the distance, tempting the lost to follow them deeper into bogs and marshes, where they would sink and drown. Some stories claimed demons whispered directions that led only to death, while others told of witches casting spells to trap wanderers forever. For a medieval traveler, being lost was not only a physical danger, but a battle with unseen forces determined to keep them from safety. Those who survived such ordeals often spoke of strange experiences. Some recalled hearing bells in the distance, believing they had found a village, only to wander endlessly without finding the source. Others swore they had followed a familiar voice, only to realize too late that no one was there. These stories became warnings to future generations, reminders that the forest was not to be trusted, and that the surest way to survive was to avoid entering it at night altogether. What made the peril of getting lost especially cruel was that it could happen to anyone, regardless of strength or courage. A noble knight, armed and armored, was no safer than a barefoot pilgrim if he strayed from the path. Once lost, both were reduced to the same vulnerability, wandering aimlessly beneath the canopy of trees. Status, wealth, and power meant nothing in the face of the forest's labyrinthine darkness. In this way, the woods were great equalizers, humbling all who underestimated them. For the modern traveler, equipped with compasses, GPS, and flashlights, it is difficult to imagine such helplessness. But for medieval people, to be lost in the forest at night was one of the deepest fears imaginable. It meant being cut off from home, from safety, from light itself, surrounded by dangers seen and unseen. To last a night under such conditions was rare, and for many, it was simply impossible. The forest swallowed them, and their stories lived on only in the warnings passed down by those who remained. Among all the dangers of the medieval forest, none loomed larger in the imagination than the predators that roamed its depths. To spend a night in the woods was to share the dark with creatures stronger, faster, and more at home there than any human could ever be. Medieval villagers knew the signs of their presence: the howl of wolves echoing across the hills, the heavy snap of a branch beneath a bear's weight, the sharp grunts of a boar rooting through the undergrowth. Each of these sounds carried a promise of danger, a reminder that survival was not guaranteed once the sun had set. The wolf stood at the center of these fears. Packs roamed across much of Europe, and they were clever hunters, working together to bring down prey many times their size. To medieval people, wolves were more than animals. They were symbols of evil, often linked with the devil in sermons and folklore. Their howls, heard on winter nights, were taken as omens of death. A lone traveler in the woods could do little against them. A single wolf might be fended off with fire or weapons, but a pack was unstoppable. Villagers told stories of men torn apart within sight of the road, of children dragged from fields, and of travelers whose remains were found only in scattered bones. These tales may have been embellished, but the fear they represented was very real. The bear, though less common by the later Middle Ages, was equally terrifying where it remained. Larger and stronger than any man, it was a force of nature. Bears could crush livestock, overturn carts, or swipe a hunter with claws, sharp enough to kill instantly. To encounter one at night, when visibility was low and escape nearly impossible, was to face raw power with no hope of victory. Unlike wolves, which sometimes fled from fire, bears could be enraged by it, charging toward the source of light. In some regions, stories of monstrous bears grew into legends, their size exaggerated until they seemed less like animals and more like demons of the wilderness itself. The wild boar, though smaller, may have been the most dangerous of all. Known for their ferocity and unpredictability, boars could charge suddenly, driving their tusks deep into anyone who crossed their path. Hunters considered them more dangerous than wolves, since they did not retreat when cornered, but fought with unmatched fury. Entire hunts, with dogs and spearmen, were needed to bring down a single boar, and many men died in the attempt. For the lone traveler who stumbled upon one in the dark, there was no chance. The sound of heavy grunting or the crash of brush nearby could send a chill down the spine, for it meant that death might be only a heartbeat away. Other predators, though less feared, still added to the sense of constant danger. Lynxes, stealthy hunters of the night, could leap from trees onto unsuspecting prey. Packs of wild dogs, descended from strays that bred unchecked, often roamed near villages, attacking sheep or even children. Foxes, martens, and other smaller carnivores might not threaten a grown man directly, but their cries in the night could be uncanny, their shrill calls mistaken for human voices. To medieval ears, these sounds confirmed the presence of spirits or demons, blurring the line between natural and supernatural threats. What made these predators especially frightening was the lack of defense available to ordinary people. A villager might carry a knife, a walking stick, or perhaps a small axe, but such tools were poor protection against a charging boar or a wolf pack. Armor and weapons were the privilege of nobles and soldiers, and even they were not safe. Chronicles tell of knights slain by boars, their lances shattered, and their armor pierced by tusks. To the common man or woman, the idea of surviving such an encounter was almost unthinkable. Fire was the only real ally, yet even that could fail when beasts were desperate with hunger. The predators of the forest also carried symbolic weight. Wolves represented chaos, bears embodied brute strength, and boars stood for unrestrained fury. These animals appeared in heraldry, in fables, and in sermons, always as warnings of danger. Their real presence in the woods gave weight to these symbols, reminding people that the dangers of sin, violence, and rage were mirrored in the world around them. To face a predator at night was not only to risk one's life, but to come face to face with forces that seemed larger than humanity itself. For modern people, the fear of such predators is difficult to grasp. Today, wolves are rare, bears are monitored, and wild boars are distant curiosities rather than daily threats. But for medieval people, these animals were neighbors, lurking at the edges of villages, sometimes snatching livestock or wandering too close to fields. Their presence was constant, and their cries at night kept entire communities awake. To venture into the forest after dark meant stepping directly into their realm, with no walls, no weapons, and no safety but the hope that dawn would come quickly. To last a night in the medieval forest, then, was to endure not only the weight of darkness and superstition, but the very real threat of predators. Each sound carried the possibility of teeth and claws, and each shadow might conceal death. For those who lived then, survival was not a given, it was a fragile gift, one against a world where nature's power pressed close and unrelenting. For medieval people, the forest was never just a collection of trees and wild creatures. It was a landscape alive with meaning, a setting where stories were born and fears were given shape. Folklore and legends wrapped themselves around the woods like ivy, making the forest a place not only of physical danger, but of myth and imagination. To tell a story in the Middle Ages was often to place it beneath the canopy of the trees, where the boundaries between reality and fantasy grew thin. And in these tales, the forest became both a stage for human struggles and a character in its own right. The forest appeared frequently as a place of trial. Heroes in stories often had to enter the dark woods to prove their courage, facing dangers that tested not only their strength, but their morality. In these legends, the forest symbolized the unknown, the untamed, and the dangerous parts of life that one had to confront in order to grow. To lose oneself in the woods was to wander astray in spirit. To emerge victorious was to achieve wisdom or redemption. This symbolism resonated deeply in a world where the forest was always close at hand, reminding listeners that the challenges of life were mirrored by the shadows of the trees. In many folk tales, the forest was also a dwelling place for the supernatural. Spirits, fairies, demons, and witches made their homes in its depths, waiting for travelers to stumble upon them. The will-o'-the-wisp, glowing in the marshes, lured wanderers deeper into danger. Fairies tricked mortals into losing their way, binding them with spells that made hours feel like years. Ghostly hunts, phantom riders, and hounds, rushing through the night sky, were said to thunder above the treetops, punishing those who strayed into cursed places. Each of these legends gave voice to the fears people already felt, transforming the creaks, cries, and shadows of the forest into living beings that haunted their imagination. The church also played a role in shaping these tales. Priests described the forest as a place of temptation and sin, where the devil roamed freely. Stories of saints often involved them, retreating into the woods to resist temptation or to fight demons in seclusion. In these accounts, the forest was a battlefield for the soul, a place where good and evil clashed invisibly around the lone traveler. For common people, such stories reinforced the belief that the woods were not only physically dangerous, but spiritually charged. Every journey beneath the branches became an echo of these larger battles, reminding them that they, too, walked between salvation and damnation. Legends also used the forest as a setting for transformation. In Arthurian romances, knights often entered the woods to encounter mysterious figures, magical beings, or trials that would shape their destiny. The forest was where enchantresses appeared, where quests began, and where truths were revealed. Though these tales belonged more to the world of nobles and courts, their influence spread widely, teaching listeners that the forest could be both threatening and wondrous. It was not only a place of fear, but also of possibility, where the ordinary rules of life gave way to something greater. Among villagers, local folklore often tied specific groves, clearings, or trees to stories of past events. A certain oak might be said to house the spirit of a murdered traveler. A spring deep in the woods might be believed to heal sickness, blessed by a saint who once passed that way. These tales gave the forest texture and memory, turning its spaces into landmarks of shared belief. To pass them at night was to feel the weight of those stories pressing close, as though the trees themselves remembered the events of long ago. The role of the forest in folklore was not purely one of terror. It also inspired wonder. Children listened with wide eyes to tales of hidden treasures buried beneath roots, of animals that spoke, and of wise hermits who lived in peace among the trees. To those who had only ever known the small world of their village, the forest was vast and full of secrets, a place where anything seemed possible. It could give as well as take, shelter as well as threaten. But because of its scale and mystery, it was always larger than life, its presence woven into every layer of storytelling. For medieval people, these legends were not idle entertainment. They shaped how people lived and how they understood the world. A villager who believed the will-o'-the-wisp was real might avoid marshy paths at night, saving themselves from a deadly fall. A pilgrim who feared fairies might cling to their rosary more tightly, finding strength in faith as they crossed the woods. Folklore and reality blended together, guiding behavior and reinforcing caution. In this sense, the stories were both protective and limiting, encouraging people to respect the dangers of the forest while deepening their fear of its shadows. To last a night in the medieval forest, then, was not only to endure the physical dangers of predators and cold, but to confront the immense weight of legend. Every sound and sight carried layers of meaning, drawn from centuries of tales told by firelight. The forest was never just a place of wood and stone. It was a realm of myth, and to sleep within it was to dream with one eye open, knowing that perhaps the stories might yet prove true. While the forest at night was feared for its predators and spirits, it was also believed to harbor human figures who lived outside the boundaries of ordinary society. Among these were herbalists, cunning folk, witches, and wanderers who had chosen or been forced to make their homes in the shadows of the trees. To medieval villagers, such figures were a mixture of fascination and dread. Some sought them out in times of need, while others whispered warnings never to cross their paths. The forest, with its hidden clearings and shelters, offered the perfect refuge for those who did not belong to village life, but this very isolation gave them an aura of danger. Herbalists were among the more ambiguous dwellers of the forest. On one hand, they were valued for their knowledge of plants, roots, and remedies. They gathered herbs at dawn and dusk, often venturing deeper into the woods than others dared to go. Villagers came to them for cures when illness struck, bringing gifts of bread or coins in exchange. But because their knowledge seemed mysterious, and because they worked so closely with the untamed forest, suspicion often clung to them. At night, the sight of a figure moving quietly with a basket could stir fear, for who but someone in league with unseen forces would dare to wander so far into the dark? Even more feared were those believed to be witches. Stories of witches gathering in secret glades, brewing potions by the light of the moon, and summoning spirits with chants filled the imagination of medieval people. The forest, beyond the reach of priests and lords, was thought to be their domain. A traveler who stumbled across such a gathering might never return, or if they did, they came back changed, cursed, sick, or haunted by visions. Women who lived alone near the woods, or those with unusual knowledge of healing and charms, were often suspected of such practices. To meet them by day was unsettling. To encounter them at night among the trees was considered perilous in the extreme. But not all hidden dwellers were feared as witches. Hermits sometimes made their homes in the forest, seeking solitude to pray and live apart from the world. For some travelers, finding a hermit's hut in the night was a blessing, a chance for shelter and a warm fire. Yet even these holy figures carried an air of mystery, for their choice to live in the wilderness marked them as different. To ordinary villagers, the forest was a place to be avoided, so those who embraced it seemed otherworldly, touched by forces beyond human understanding. Whether revered or mistrusted, Such figures added to the sense that the woods were filled with strange and hidden lives. The fear of hidden dwellers also reflected deeper anxieties about outsiders. Bandits and outlaws often made camps in the forest, but so too did the poor, the displaced, or those cast out from their villages. At night, a traveler might see the glow of a fire through the trees, and not know whether it belonged to a hermit, a healer, or a group of thieves. This uncertainty created constant unease. To approach could mean safety or disaster. Many chose to turn away, preferring to spend the night cold and alone rather than risk whatever company lay ahead. Superstition magnified these fears. It was said that witches could appear as ordinary women by day, but reveal their true forms in the dark forest at night. Herbalists might be blessed by nature spirits, giving them powers to heal or to curse. Even hermits were sometimes rumored to speak with angels or demons in their solitude, their prayers echoing into the night. Every figure who lived in the forest, no matter how benign, was touched by the imagination of those who feared it. As a result, encounters with such people became the stuff of stories told and retold, warning others of the risks of wandering after dark. Imagine then the plight of a lone traveler who, in the dead of night, stumbles upon a small hut hidden among the trees. A faint glow of firelight escapes through the cracks. Does he knock, hoping for warmth and safety, or does he flee, fearing he has found the dwelling of a witch? In the medieval mind, the answer was never simple, for every step deeper into the woods carried both the promise of help and the threat of doom. And so many chose to avoid such places entirely, even if it meant enduring hunger and cold until dawn. For modern people, the idea of meeting an herbalist or hermit in the woods may seem quaint, even comforting. But for medieval villagers, such encounters were charged with suspicion and unease. The forest was not a neutral ground. It was a space where the ordinary rules of life no longer applied, where outsiders dwelled beyond the reach of law and church. To last a night in such a place meant not only facing beasts and spirits, but also the unsettling presence of other humans who lived apart from the world, cloaked in secrecy and mystery. In their company, safety was never certain, and fear was never far away. Not all the dangers of the medieval forest came from beasts, spirits, or outlaws. Some of the most perilous threats came from men of power, kings, nobles, and lords who claimed vast tracts of woodland as their own. These hunting grounds were jealously guarded, their resources reserved for the elite, and the laws protecting them were often harsh. To stray into such forests without permission could mean fines, imprisonment, mutilation, or even death. For the common person, the forest at night was not only a wilderness, but also a domain marked by strict authority, where a single wrong step might bring the wrath of those who ruled. Royal forests were established across much of Europe, particularly in England, France, and Germany. These were not small enclosures, but massive stretches of land set aside for the hunting of deer, boar, and other game prized by nobles. The forest laws that governed them were some of the strictest in medieval society. Cutting down trees, trapping animals, or even gathering firewood could be punished severely. The laws were designed not only to protect resources, but to remind commoners of their place. The forest, in these cases, belonged not to the people who lived nearby, but to the powerful men who claimed it by decree. At night, these hunting grounds became even more dangerous. Patrols of wardens, foresters, and armed guards moved through the trees, watching for intruders. To be caught in such a place after dark was to invite suspicion of poaching, whether guilty or not. Punishments could be brutal: hands cut off for setting traps, eyes put out for stealing deer, or execution for repeat offenders. The fear of these consequences weighed heavily on villagers, many of whom relied on the forest for survival. To risk gathering wood or catching a rabbit might mean feeding one's sea family for a night, but it could also mean losing everything. The presence of noble hunting parties added another layer of danger. Kings and lords rode through the woods with hounds and retainers, their hunts often violent spectacles of dominance. A commoner who stumbled into such an event could be trampled, mistaken for prey, or punished simply for being where they did not belong. Stories spread of peasants beaten or killed for crossing paths with a noble's hunt, their deaths treated as accidents or dismissed outright. To spend a night in such a forest was to live under the constant threat of discovery, where even survival instincts like lighting a fire or snaring a rabbit might draw fatal attention. For the poor, this injustice was bitter. The forest provided food, fuel, and shelter, yet access was denied to those who needed it most. Villagers often entered secretly, slipping in by night to gather fallen branches or to hunt small game. They moved quietly, avoiding patrols and keeping their fires small, hoping not to be caught. The risk was immense, but necessity drove them. Hunger was a force more powerful than fear, and many chose to gamble with the law rather than watch their families starve. Each night spent in the royal woods was an act of quiet defiance, a struggle against the authority that tried to keep the forest beyond their reach. Folklore reflected these tensions. Ballads and tales celebrated poachers as folk heroes, men who defied the king's law to bring food to the poor. Robin Hood, though later romanticized, grew out of such traditions, embodying the common man's resistance against unjust authority. These stories painted the forest not only as a place of fear, but also as a symbol of rebellion, where ordinary people could strike back against those who oppressed them. Yet the reality was far harsher. Most who defied the laws were punished severely, and the forest remained a place where power, not justice, ruled. For travelers, the threat of trespassing added one more layer of anxiety to the night. Even those with no intention of poaching might be suspected if found in the woods. A pilgrim seeking shelter beneath the trees, a messenger forced to take a shortcut, or a villager returning late from work could all be accused of crimes simply by being present. The uncertainty of who might be watching and what authority they represented made the forest feel even more oppressive. It was not only the wild that stalked the night, but the reach of kings and nobles as well. To last a night in a medieval forest, then, meant more than surviving wolves and spirits. It meant avoiding the wrath of men who claimed dominion over land and life alike. A torch seen in the distance might be a bandit or a forester with the power to ruin your life. In this way, the medieval forest was not just nature's domain, but also a tool of authority, where law and punishment hung heavy in the dark. For the common man, it was a reminder that danger did not end with sunrise or superstition, but lived also in the commands of those who ruled from afar. Even if one escaped the wolves, outlaws, and spirits of the medieval forest, the elements themselves could be just as deadly. To spend a night beneath the canopy was to face not only the darkness, but the weather in all its unrelenting forms. Without proper shelter, without warm clothing, and without the comforts of modern equipment, a single cold or wet night could be enough to weaken the strongest traveler. For medieval people, the forest's weather was not an inconvenience, but a force of life and death. The cold was perhaps the most dangerous. Without fires or thick blankets, night air in the forest cut deep, chilling bones and sapping strength. Even in the height of summer, the shade of the trees could trap cold air, making the night far cooler than nearby villages or fields. In autumn and winter, when frost clung to leaves and mist rose from the ground, the forest became an icy trap. A traveler might begin the night with energy and resolve, only to find their limbs stiffening, their teeth chattering, and their strength slipping away as hours dragged on. Hypothermia was not a term medieval people knew, but they understood well that the cold could kill silently, without beast or blade. Dampness was a constant companion in the woods. The canopy kept sunlight from drying the ground, leaving earth moist and heavy even in fair weather. Rain transformed the forest floor into a mire, soaking shoes and clothing until every step was a struggle. Once wet, Wool and linen lost their warmth, clinging to the skin and draining the body's heat. Villagers who worked the woods by day often returned chilled and weary, even in summer. At night, when there was no relief, the damp became suffocating. Fires could be difficult to light with wet wood, and even when lit, the smoke often clung heavily beneath the trees, stinging eyes and lungs. Storms were especially terrifying. Lightning cracked above the treetops, illuminating the forest in blinding flashes that revealed twisted branches like skeletal arms. Thunder rolled through the trees, magnified by echoes, until it felt as though the entire earth trembled. Rain poured down in sheets, drenching travelers and flooding low paths into streams. The forest floor became treacherous, roots slick, rocks slippery, and rivers swollen with rushing water. For those without shelter, storms turned the night into an ordeal of survival, where every gust of wind threatened to bring down branches or even whole trees upon the unlucky. Even without storms, the forest's weather created constant hazards. Heavy fog could roll in, smothering sight until the trees stood only a few paces away like ghostly pillars. A traveler could wander in circles, unable to tell direction or distance, while sounds became muffled and distorted in the mist. Frost made every step dangerous, turning roots and stones into slick traps. The simple act of walking could result in a fall, an injury that might prove fatal when alone in the night. Nature itself seemed to conspire against those who trespassed its darkness. For villagers, weather in the forest carried a spiritual meaning as well. Cold winds were thought to be the breath of spirits, storms the wrath of God, and mists the veil of the otherworld. These beliefs only heightened the fear of travelers, who interpreted every change in weather as a sign or warning. A sudden gust at midnight might be a demon passing close. A storm might mean punishment for sins, falling not only upon the guilty, but upon anyone caught in its path. In this way, the natural dangers of weather blended with superstition, making the night seem alive with intention and malice. Those who survived such nights often described them in harrowing terms. Chronicles tell of soldiers lost in freezing rain, their armor rusting against their skin as they shivered through the night. Pilgrims wrote of fog that swallowed entire groups, separating them until they found one another only at dawn, terrified and half frozen. Villagers spoke of neighbors who entered the woods to gather wood or hunt and never returned, their bodies found days later beneath fallen branches or by swollen streams. These stories served as grim reminders that the forest's greatest weapon was not fang or claw, but the relentless force of weather itself. To last a night in the medieval forest, then, required endurance beyond what most people possessed. It meant finding shelter beneath dripping branches, huddling close to a fire that might sputter and die, and praying that the cold or rain would not sap away strength before dawn. For modern people, with tents, coats, and sleeping bags, the challenge would still be harsh. For medieval travelers, with little more than cloaks and courage, it was often unbearable. The forest's weather showed no mercy, and under its cold and damp embrace, many lives were claimed silently in the night. Even if one managed to escape predators, outlaws, spirits, and the brutal weather, the medieval forest still hid dangers that could not be seen in the moment. The woods were alive with countless small threats, diseases, parasites, and infections that could quietly weaken or kill those who spent too long beneath the trees. In an age without antibiotics, vaccines, or even a clear understanding of germs, the smallest wound or bite could become a death sentence. To last a night in a medieval forest was not only about surviving until dawn, but avoiding the hidden illnesses that followed long after. Insects were among the most constant hazards. Mosquitoes thrived near marshes and streams, carrying fevers that people did not understand but feared deeply. Fleas and lice clung to clothing and skin, spreading sickness from one person to another. Ticks, though unnoticed at the time, could leave behind fevers and infections. A single night spent on damp ground, surrounded by biting insects, could leave a traveler weak for weeks to come. In medieval minds, these fevers were often attributed to bad air or curses, yet their cause lay in the very creatures that filled the forest night. Wounds, even small ones, carried enormous risk. A scratch from a thorn, a cut from a fall, or the bite of an animal could fester quickly without proper care. With no knowledge of sterilization, medieval people often left wounds unclean or treated them with remedies that did more harm than good. Infection set in easily, turning a minor injury into a swelling, feverish illness. Travelers who survived a night in the woods often carried home more than fear. They carried wounds that lingered, sometimes taking their lives days or weeks later. The forest did not always kill swiftly. It often marked its victims slowly, through the quiet spread of infection. The damp conditions of the woods encouraged sickness as well. Sleeping on cold ground chilled the body, weakening it against illness. Medieval people spoke often of ague, a term used for fevers and chills that struck after nights spent in damp places. Pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses likely lay behind many such cases. Without warm bedding, travelers woke soaked in dew or rain, their lungs heavy and their strength fading. To villagers who told these stories, the forest itself seemed to breathe sickness, as though the very air at night was poisoned. Animals also carried diseases that threatened humans. Wolves, dogs, and foxes could spread rabies through bites, a terrifying illness that medieval people could not cure. Livestock stolen or scavenged from the forest sometimes carried parasites that infected those who ate them. Rats and other vermin, abundant in the underbrush, were carriers of fleas that spread plague. Though people did not understand the exact causes, they recognized that sickness followed close on the heels of such creatures. To be bitten or scratched in the forest was a cause for dread, for it meant that the body might already be carrying invisible doom. Superstition filled the gaps in understanding. Many believed that diseases were sent by spirits who lingered in the forest, punishing those who trespassed at night. Some thought witches cursed wanderers with fevers, or poisoned them with herbs hidden in their path. Others saw sickness as a divine punishment for sins, with the forest acting as the stage for God's justice. Whatever the explanation, the fear was the same. Illness was an unseen enemy, stalking travelers as surely as wolves or bandits, and often harder to escape. For those who survived nights in the forest, sickness often followed them home, leading families to watch as fevers consumed their loved ones. Chronicles mention men who returned from journeys pale and trembling, only to die within days. Pilgrims told of companions struck with sudden ague after sleeping outdoors, left behind on the road as others continued their path. Villagers whispered of hunters who never rose again after a night spent in cold rain, their bodies taken by illness rather than beast. These stories blurred the line between natural disease and supernatural vengeance, reinforcing the belief that the forest was a place of hidden curses. From our modern perspective, with medicine and sanitation, we might overlook these dangers. Yet even today, camping without proper gear in damp, insect-filled woods can bring sickness. For medieval people who lacked even the simplest protections, the risk was overwhelming. A single night could plant the seeds of fever, infection, or plague. To last such a night was not merely to reach the dawn alive, but to survive the days and weeks that followed. The forest claimed lives not only with claws and cold, but with the invisible, relentless hand of disease. In the medieval forest, warmth and light were more than comforts, they were lifelines. To last a night beneath the trees meant keeping the cold at bay, keeping predators distant, and keeping fear from consuming the mind. For this, people turned to fire and torches, but even these were not simple to manage. What might seem to us like a basic survival skill was, in the Middle Ages, a difficult and dangerous challenge. Fire was both ally and enemy, and the struggle to sustain it through the night often determined who survived and who did not. The first obstacle was simply starting a fire. Medieval travelers did not carry matches or lighters. Instead, they relied on flint and steel, or sometimes a tinderbox with scraps of charred cloth. Striking sparks in the dark, especially when wood was damp, could be frustrating or even impossible. Many who entered the forest at night carried no such tools at all, leaving them entirely at the mercy of the cold. To those unprepared, the forest was merciless. Without fire, warmth faded quickly, and the night became a test of endurance that most could not pass. Even when a fire was lit, keeping it alive was a constant struggle. Wet wood smoked heavily, filling the air with choking haze. Dry wood was often scarce, and what little could be found burned quickly, demanding constant feeding. Travelers huddled close, guarding their flames from sudden gusts of wind that threatened to extinguish them. Every spark was precious, every ember guarded as though it were life itself. The glow of fire gave comfort, but it was fragile, always on the verge of vanishing into darkness. To tend a fire in the forest was to battle nature itself, moment by moment, through the long hours of night. Torches, too, were important but unreliable. Made of wood wrapped with cloth and soaked in pitch or fat, they burned unevenly, sometimes sputtering out within minutes. Their light was weak, illuminating only a few steps ahead, and their flames cast shifting shadows that made the forest seem alive with movement. Travelers carried them not only for sight, but as weapons, waving them at wolves or holding them close to ward off unseen threats. Yet torches were heavy, smoky, and fleeting. To carry one for hours drained the body, and when it burned out, the darkness returned thicker than before. Fire, however, brought its own dangers. A glowing flame could be seen for miles in the forest, drawing attention from bandits, outlaws, or even soldiers guarding noble hunting grounds. To light a fire was to announce one's presence, risking discovery by those who might mean harm. Even animals were unpredictable. While many feared fire, others grew bold enough to investigate its source. The same light that gave safety could also summon danger, leaving travelers torn between fear of freezing and fear of being found. Each decision carried its own risks, and neither choice offered true security. There was also the danger of the forest itself catching fire. Dry leaves, branches, and underbrush could ignite quickly if sparks spread, turning a small campfire into a raging blaze. Though rain and dampness often limited this risk, the fear remained. A careless flame could consume not only the traveler, but entire stretches of woodland, leaving destruction in its wake. In some regions, such fires were remembered in tales, blamed on witches or divine wrath, but their root was often the same, a desperate struggle to keep warm in a place where the night offered no mercy. For those who managed to maintain a fire, the circle of light it created became a fragile sanctuary. Beyond it, the darkness pressed close, hiding countless threats. Within it, a traveler might find a moment of rest, their face warmed and their heart steadied by the flickering glow. Yet even here, sleep was elusive. The fire demanded tending, and the fear of it dying out kept eyes open long into the night. Every crackle and pop reminded the listener of what lay beyond, waiting for the light to fail. Rest came in fits, broken by the need to stir embers, add wood, or peer into the shadows. For medieval people, fire held deep symbolic meaning. It represented life, protection, and even the presence of God. To lose it was to surrender to the cold, to darkness, and to fear. Many prayers were whispered over flames, asking for strength and safety until morning. Villagers told stories of travelers saved by miraculous fires that would not go out, or of cursed flames that vanished just when they were needed most. Fire was never taken for granted. It was a gift, a fragile guardian in a hostile world. To last a night in the medieval forest, one needed more than courage. One needed fire difficult to create, harder to keep, and dangerous to reveal. Without it, the cold and darkness consumed the body and the mind alike. With it, survival was possible, though never guaranteed. In the struggle to hold a spark against the vastness of the night, medieval people found themselves humbled, reminded of how thin the line was between life and death beneath the trees. For the ordinary medieval villager, the forest was both a source of life and a place of dread. By day, it provided wood for fires, herbs for healing, and game for food. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, the same forest transformed into something entirely different, a place of fear, superstition, and danger. Few villagers ever willingly set foot among the trees at night, and those who did often became the subject of whispered stories, their bravery or foolishness remembered long after. To understand how people viewed the forest at night is to see how deeply fear and imagination shaped daily medieval life. In the village, the edge of the forest marked the edge of safety. Within the fields, cottages, and church bells, life had a rhythm, familiar and ordered. Beyond those fields lay the trees, and once darkness fell, the boundary felt sharper than ever. Children were warned sternly never to stray too close at dusk, for it was believed that spirits and beasts grew bold as the light faded. Parents told cautionary tales at the hearth, describing how foolish wanderers who ignored such warnings were never seen again. These stories were not simply meant to frighten, but to preserve life, ensuring that people respected the dangers beyond the village. Many villagers believed that the forest at night was alive with presences beyond human understanding. The rustle of leaves might be spirits stirring. The cry of an owl could mean death was near. Strange lights flickering in the distance were interpreted as signs of demons or fairies. For those who lived their entire lives within small communities, rarely traveling far, the unknown stretched vast and terrifying. The forest was not only a place of physical danger, but a canvas for their deepest fears, a realm where every superstition seemed possible. To linger outside at night, even on the village's edge, was enough to send shivers through the bravest. At the same time, the forest held a certain allure. Some villagers admired its power and mystery, recognizing that it was a world apart from their ordered lives. Songs and tales passed down through generations spoke of knights, saints, or even ordinary men who ventured into the woods and returned transformed. While most feared the forest at night, there remained a quiet fascination, a sense that it was a place where the ordinary rules of life fell away. This mixture of awe and terror shaped how the forest was remembered in story and song, always dangerous, always larger than life. Religious teachings reinforced these views. Priests warned that the forest was the devil's domain, a place of temptation where men could be led astray. Sermons used its imagery to describe the soul lost in sin, wandering in the darkness until guided back by God's light. For villagers who attended church weekly, such teachings gave the forest a moral weight. It was not only dangerous to the body, but perilous to the soul. To spend a night within it was to risk more than death. It was to risk damnation. This spiritual dimension deepened the fear, ensuring that people saw the woods as hostile in ways beyond the physical. The practical dangers reinforced the beliefs. When hunters failed to return, when children wandered off and were found lifeless at the edge of the trees, when travelers disappeared without trace, villagers explained these tragedies through the lens of both reality and superstition. Wolves might have attacked, or perhaps spirits had claimed them. Outlaws could be responsible, or maybe fairies had led them astray. In truth, all these explanations reflected the same conclusion. The forest at night was not safe, and no ordinary person belonged there once darkness fell. And yet, despite this fear, the forest remained essential. People had to venture near for wood, for grazing, or for hunting. Some did so in secret, slipping into the trees at dusk to gather what they needed, praying for protection as they hurried home. These quiet acts of necessity revealed the tension between dependence and dread. The forest was both provider and predator, and the people who lived beside it balanced gratitude with fear. Their view of it at night was shaped not by choice, but by survival, always walking the line between need and caution. For modern readers, the medieval villagers' fear of the night forest may seem exaggerated. But for those who lived without lights, weapons, or medicine, it was entirely rational. Every howl, every shadow, every story passed down through the generations confirmed the danger. To step into the forest at night was to step away from the safety of community and into a world that cared nothing for human life. For the villager, the forest at night was not just a place, it was a presence, vast and unforgiving, one that demanded respect, fear, and distance. While folklore and superstition shaped much of how medieval people thought about the forest, their fears were not only born from imagination. Chronicles, letters, and court records from the Middle Ages provide vivid accounts of real events that confirmed the dangers of the woods at night. These stories, preserved by monks, travelers, and villagers alike, remind us that the forest's reputation was earned through centuries of lived experience. To hear these accounts is to glimpse the harsh reality that lay beneath the myths. One common thread in these records is the presence of wolves. Chroniclers in France, Germany, and England often wrote of wolf attacks during harsh winters, when hunger drove the animals closer to villages. A 13th century English account describes wolves descending on travelers near Yorkshire, dragging one man into the trees while his companions fled in terror. In another report from Germany, entire packs were said to follow pilgrims on the road, circling them until they reached the safety of a monastery gate. Though some details may have been exaggerated, the fear was rooted in real encounters, many of which ended in death. Banditry was also a recurring theme. Records of trials and punishments tell of men captured after attacking travelers in the woods. One account from 14th century France describes a group of merchants ambushed at dusk, their goods stolen, and 2 of them left slain by the roadside. In England, outlaw bands hiding in Sherwood and other forests appear repeatedly in legal documents, accused of robbery, murder, and extortion. These were not just legends spun for entertainment, but matters of record, entered into the rolls of courts and remembered by the families of those who never returned. For villagers, each new tale confirmed what they already believed. The forest was a trap, waiting for the unwary. Accidents added to the danger. Monastic chronicles tell of pilgrims who lost their way in heavy fog, wandering into swamps where they drowned. Others recorded hunters gored by wild boars, their companions barely able to drag the wounded men back to safety. A German chronicle from the early 15th century tells of a knight who vanished while traveling at night, his horse later found wandering near the trees without its rider. No one ever discovered his fate, and villagers whispered that the forest itself had claimed him. Whether through beast, bandit, or simple misfortune, the woods left behind countless stories of lives cut short. Superstitious accounts appear alongside these practical ones, blending fact with fear. In some chronicles, travelers reported seeing strange lights moving through the forest, which they believed to be spirits or demons. A letter from a pilgrim in Italy describes hearing ghostly chanting in the distance while resting at the edge of a wood, a sound that left the group too terrified to sleep. Another tale, preserved in English folklore, tells of a woman who vanished after following what she thought was the voice of her husband calling her name. Such accounts were treated seriously, reinforcing the belief that the forest was as spiritually dangerous as it was physically threatening. What makes these records compelling is how ordinary they are. They do not describe heroes or knights facing noble trials, but everyday people, villagers, merchants, pilgrims, messengers meeting with disaster in the woods. Their stories were repeated by families and communities, passed down not only as warnings, but as memories of real losses. The forest was not a distant place of legend, but an ever-present threat, close enough to touch and familiar enough to haunt daily life. For historians today, these accounts reveal how closely fear and reality were intertwined. Wolves truly did attack, bandits truly did ambush, and travelers truly did vanish in the woods. Superstition filled the gaps where explanation failed, but the foundation of fear was built upon loved experience. To medieval people, the forest was not a symbol to be interpreted from afar. It was a neighbor, one whose dangers could be felt in every howl, every theft, and every disappearance. To last a night in the medieval forest, then, was not only to survive imagined dangers, but to face the very real risks that countless people had endured before. The chronicles stand as quiet witnesses, reminding us that behind every story told by the fire lay the shadow of truth, carved into the lives of those who entered the forest and never came back. When imagining the terrors of the medieval forest at night, it is tempting for us to think we would fare better. We have knowledge they did not. We understand natural causes behind strange sounds, and we dismiss many of the superstitions that haunted the medieval mind. Yet, in truth, a modern person would likely struggle even more to endure such a night. Stripped of our conveniences, unfamiliar with the rhythms of nature, and unused to true darkness or danger, we would face the forest with far less preparation than those who lived beside it centuries ago. The first challenge would be the simple absence of light. Modern people rarely experience total darkness. Street lamps, flashlights, and phones mean that some glow is always present. In a medieval forest, however, the blackness would be complete, pressing in on all sides. Without a flashlight or artificial glow, our eyes would strain, our fear would rise, and our sense of direction would vanish. Medieval travelers at least carried torches or knew how to strike a fire from flint and steel, skills few of us possess today. To face the forest without light would leave us almost helpless from the start. Then there is the matter of survival skills. Medieval villagers grew up close to nature. They knew which herbs might be safe to eat, which trees provided dry wood, and how to build a shelter from branches and leaves. They could track paths by instinct, read the stars for direction, and recognize the calls of animals. By contrast, most modern people lack even the most basic knowledge of foraging, navigation, or fire building. Where a medieval peasant might endure discomfort, a modern person would face panic, weakened by hunger, thirst, or cold within hours. Predators, too, would feel more threatening to us. Medieval people lived with the constant presence of animals, livestock, dogs, and wild beasts on the edges of villages. They were accustomed to the sounds of wolves howling or boars grunting, even if they feared them. A modern person, hearing such noises in pitch darkness, would likely be paralyzed by fear. The knowledge that wolves rarely attack humans would offer little comfort when dozens of yellow eyes gleamed from the tree line. Our rational explanations falter in the presence of raw instinct, and the forest at night would stir panic in even the calmest heart. Even the weather would strike us harder. Medieval people were hardened to cold, damp, and discomfort in ways most modern bodies are not. Their lives required daily endurance of hardship, working in fields through rain, sleeping in unheated cottages, walking long distances on rough roads. A sudden chill or a wet night might bring illness, but they endured it more readily than we could. A modern person, accustomed to warmth, shelter, and dry clothing, would find the damp air and icy ground unbearable. Within hours, shivering and exhaustion would set in, eroding strength and willpower. Beyond the physical, there is the psychological. Medieval people explained the forest through folklore and religion. Spirits, demons, and fairies gave names to their fears, providing a framework for understanding the unknown. A modern person, stripped of both faith and familiarity, might find the forest even more terrifying, precisely because it defies explanation. Each sound and shadow would feel alien, not part of a shared cultural story, but a chaotic, hostile reminder of how far removed we are from the natural world. Panic would creep in, overwhelming reason, leaving the traveler paralyzed by dread. Technology has also made us soft in ways we seldom realize. We rely on phones for direction, stoves for warmth, and packaged food for sustenance. Without them, we are quickly reminded of how fragile we are. A medieval peasant, though fearful of the forest, carried resilience born of necessity. They expected hardship and prepared for it. A modern person, thrust into the same situation, would lack both preparation and expectation. Fear, hunger, and cold would combine to crush morale swiftly, leaving few able to endure until morning. And finally, there is the simple fact of solitude. Medieval people lived in close-knit communities, their lives woven tightly together. Even when terrified, they carried the strength of shared belief and common experience. A modern person, alone in the forest, would carry only isolation. Cut off from light, comfort, and communication, the mind would spiral into fear faster than most could control. What medieval people endured through faith and familiarity, we would face with panic and despair. To last a night in a medieval forest, then, would be harder for us than for those who lived centuries ago. Stripped of our tools, weakened by comfort, and alienated from nature, we would find ourselves at the mercy of darkness, predators, weather, and fear. For all our knowledge and technology in the silence of the woods, we would be reminded of a truth medieval people knew well, that humans are small, fragile creatures, and that the forest at night belongs not to us, but to the shadows. And so, as we leave the shadows of the medieval forest behind, we are reminded of just how fragile life once was when faced with nature's unrelenting power. For people of the Middle Ages, the woods at night were not an adventure or a retreat, but a place of dread and survival. Wolves and bears, bandits and outlaws, witches and spirits. Cold and damp, all these dangers combined to make the forest a place where even a single night could be a trial of body and soul. The trees whispered with legends, the darkness pressed with fear, and every sound hinted at unseen threats. To step into such a world was to confront mortality in its rawest form, where dawn was not guaranteed and safety was never assured. For us today, the forest may seem peaceful, even calming, but that is because we approach it with the comforts of light, shelter, and security waiting nearby. Strip those away, and we too would falter. The medieval forest reveals to us how deeply humans have always feared the unknown, and how those fears shaped stories, legends, and even laws that lasted for centuries. It was a place of testing, where courage was measured, and where survival was never promised. To imagine yourself there, under the canopy of darkness, is to glimpse the vulnerability of those who lived long before us. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, I invite you to subscribe to *History for Sleep*. Here we bring you calm and detailed explorations of the past, perfect for drifting into rest while learning something new. In the comments, let us know which topics fascinate you most, and when you like to listen, whether it's as you're falling asleep at night, during quiet afternoons, or in the stillness of early mornings. Your thoughts guide the stories we tell, and your voice helps shape this growing community. Now, as you rest, know that you are safe, far from the shadows of the medieval forest. The dangers of that world are long past, and what remains are the stories, gently told to carry you into sleep. Let the echoes of history fade into dreams, and may the night bring you peace.